Hey, this is Coach Anderson from Mississippi Public Broadcasting Online U.S. History from 1877 to present. Today we're going to pick up again with the U.S. History Review to try to get you prepared, of course, for that U.S. History assessment. Keep in mind what we've always said about that assessment. This is the last assessment, which in my mind makes it the most important assessment, because what it does, of course, is it sets you up for a great senior year. So let's do what we can to learn as much as we can today about what we should be doing, of course, to review. We'll start today with lesson number 9, and it is on standard number 8. It says Post-War America and the Cold War from 1877 to present. Now, what we're going to talk about, of course, is the test blueprint for a few moments. And looking at the test blueprint, what it does, of course, is it gives you an idea of where most of the test items are going to come from. And if you pay attention to the blueprint, as we've told you in previous lessons, the contemporary history part, the contemporary United States that covers standards 10, 11, and 12 is where the majority of the test items come from. And you might want to keep that in mind, of course, as you're going through and you're studying. Mississippi Standard, U.S. History 8, post-World War II, President Truman and President Eisenhower assessed the evolving role of the United States in global affairs and the domestic impact on national security, individual freedoms, and changing culture. What we're basically going to talk about is how the United States of America responds to the post WWII period, starting with the GI Bill and then going through with the Cold War. All right, post-war America and the Cold War. Post-war America marked a time of prosperity and fear. The GI Bill aided middle-class American efforts to get educations and get low-interest mortgages, which fueled the suburbanization movement. The movement also aided urban decay as white flight occurred, leaving American cities to minorities. The post-war prosperity also led to the rise in American births from 1946 to 1964, resulting in the baby boom and the baby boom generation, of which I am a proud member. Here on the right, what you see, of course, is Lewistown, Pennsylvania, which was one of the first early suburbs that was made possible because of the GI Bill. Returning veterans were able to come home, get low interest loans, and build these cookie cutter homes outside major cities. And that's when we'll see that a lot of America's historically urban population starts to move to the suburbs. The modern civil rights movement started as returning black veterans demanded equal treatment upon returning home from World War II, spurred by the Double V campaign. And what the Double V campaign did is it advocated for a victory against the fascists in Europe, but it also advocated a victory against oppression and discrimination back home for African Americans in the United States. President Harry Truman started the process of ending segregation by desegregating the military as white and black soldiers fought in desegregated units in the Korean War. Brown v. Board of Education of 1954 legally ended segregation of schools in 1954 with the NAACP civil rights attorney Thurgood Marshall arguing the case before the Supreme Court. Here you see on the right a desegregated Marine unit during the Korean War. It marked the first time officially that black and white American soldiers fought side by side. Origins of the Cold War. The capitalist U.S. and the communist Soviet Union emerged from World War II as rivals on the global stage, starting the Cold War, which would be a war of tensions between the two nations until 1991. The two nations never came to blows, but there was an obvious tension, of course, from the post-World War II period up until 1941, where both countries struggled to see who would be, number one, of course, in the pecking order when it came to the global politics. The Marshall Plan created after World War II by the U.S. was America's effort to rebuild war-torn Europe and prevent the spread of communism. The result was European nations ended up on two sides, with Western European nations allied with the U.S. in NATO, and the Eastern European nations aligned with the Soviet Union in the Warsaw Pact. Here you see a picture of dominoes here: China, Korea, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, of course, up into India. And we're going to find that the two presidents that we most often talk about with the origins of the Cold War, just as a standard in Standard 8 that we're addressing today, starts with Truman and Eisenhower. Both Truman and Eisenhower were pioneers in the Cold War, and both advocated containment of communism in its existing borders, where both would utilize different strategies, however. But that goal was the same yet and still. Eisenhower put forth the domino theory that if one nation in Southeast Asia is allowed to fall to communism, others surrounding it would also fall, hence the dominoes that you see at the top up there. Containment would exist from Presidents Truman to George H. Bush, and the U.S. would provide support to nations like Korea, Vietnam, Grenada, and Nicaragua that were resisting communism. All right, McCarthyism and the Second Red Scare. After the First World War, we had a Red Scare where people in the United States of America feared that we were going to be taken over by communists. And after World War II, we had the same fear. Senator Joseph McCarthy inflamed fears of communists infiltrating federal government, starting a second Red Scare after World War II. McCarthy used lies to further his agenda and keep himself in the political spotlight. The result was widespread fear of communist subversion in the United States and the creation of HUAC to expose communists in America, blacklists like the Hollywood 10 and the Loyalty Review Program to vet federal employees. The Second Red Scare exposed traitors loyal to the Soviet Union like Alger Hiss and the Rosenbergs. It was a very fearful time in the United States of America where neighbors, feared neighbors, were communist sympathizers. And we're going to find that that distrust is going to kind of permeate throughout 1950s and the early 1960s America. We had two wars that we fought that dealt with the Cold War that the United States of America had a significant role in. The first was the Korean War. It was fought over communism in the North, trying to take over the free democratic people in the South, and then communists in North Vietnam taking over the free democratic people, of course, in South Vietnam. In both wars, the U.S. intervenes to prevent the spread of communism from the North to the South. Korea from 1950 to 1953 ended in a stalemate with communism north of the 38th parallel, and Vietnam in 1965 and 1975 divides the American public, with communism eventually taking control after the U.S. withdrawal. Violent protests over Vietnam would divide the American public, with police killing student protesters at Kent State and Jackson State, and it becomes one of those very troubling times in the history of the United States of America. Here you see some of the protests, of course, or what it looked like, of course, during some of the protests. And what I want to point out to you is this active duty against the war. So it wasn't just people who were not involved in the war, of course, that were at home that were protesting the war, but you also had active duty military that was also protesting the war. Down in the bottom here, you'll see some veterans, that were protesting the war, the most famous of which is Ron Kovich, who had a movie that was made called Born on the 4th of July, in which he talked about his disapproval, of course, for the U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. The Berlin Airlift and the Berlin Wall. The United States' commitment to prevent the spread of communism was exemplified by the Berlin Airlift. The U.S. airlifted supplies into Soviet-blockaded West Germany to prevent its fall to communism. The Berlin Wall was built by the Soviets to prevent communist East Berliners from fleeing to democratic West Berlin. It became a symbol of communism and its fall in 1889, signaling the beginning of the end of communism in Europe. Now, once again, what Truman and Eisenhower both advocated was keeping communism in its existing spaces. And one of the things that especially Eisenhower tried to do is he felt like that there was peace through strength. So what he advocated was to make the United States of America as strong as he could militarily to prevent the possibility of war. Throughout the Cold War, the United States and Soviet Union engaged in an arms race, which were both stockpiled weapons to serve as the deterrent to the other side not to attack. It operated on the principle of mutually assured destruction. So the more weapons that we made, the safer we supposedly felt. Sounds kind of contradictory, but in their mind it made sense. Presidents Eisenhower and Reagan both increased America's commitment to producing more and better nuclear arms than the Soviet Union. The space race. One of the things that the Cold War made us aware of is the fact that when it came to science and technology, that the Soviet Union was putting more resources in it and that the United States of America needed to do more to catch up. The Soviet development of their atomic bomb put them on equal military footing with the United States. The Soviet launch of the satellite Sputnik indicated that the Soviet Union was ahead of the United States in technology. And Sputnik's launching caused the increase in more science and math education in American schools, and a commitment by JFK to put a man on the moon before 1970 and develop better missile technology in the United States. Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis. The two defining foreign policy moments under John F. Kennedy was the failed attempt by the U.S. to overthrow Fidel Castro as the leader of Cuba with the Bay of Pigs invasion, and the Cuban Missile Crisis, which brought the U.S. and the Soviet Union to the brink of war. When the Soviets placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, the U.S. prevailed and the Soviets removed the missiles only with them to be returned later. And this is one of the significant opportunities for the United States of America to show strength. And Kennedy's up to the challenge, and what he does, of course, is he, through his defiance, the Soviets backed down, and Nikita Khrushchev, the premier of the Soviet Union, removed the missiles from Cuba, only to replace them a little bit later. Détente and arms control. Nixon changed the U.S. foreign policy from containment to détente. So he goes away from the strategies of Truman, Eisenhower, John F. Kennedy, and Johnson. And what détente would do, it would relax the tensions between the U.S. and the Soviet Union and the U.S. and China, the two major communist nations. The Helsinki Accords created the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, agreements which would reduce nuclear arms between the United States and the Soviet Union, and through détente, the U.S. would recognize the existence of communist China. All right, the end of the Cold War. Now, once again, the Cold War was the tensions between the United States of America and the Soviet Union and China, and it lasted from the end of World War II up until 1991. Now, at no point did the United States of America engage either one of those enemies, even though it came close a couple times in Korea, of course, in Vietnam with the Chinese. The Cold War ended with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, and the fall of the Soviet Union gave way to the U.S. becoming the global military and economic superpower. Now, what we try to do, of course, is to give you as much of a recap as we could, and there was a lot of information, that we had to kind of go through there. But you have to understand it spans about, seven presidents. I think 7 presidents, if I'm doing my math right. It may not be quite right, but I think about 7 presidents. So, and their ideas, of course, change throughout. So when we look at the United States of America and the Soviet Union, and we're talking about the Cold War here, it is important to understand that no fighting actually took place. Once again, what we also try to do with this particular lesson is to give you some facts that, of course, that you need to master in order to do well when it comes to the state test. And here is a list of relevant post-World War II and Cold War facts. And we'll just scroll through them, kind of give you a brief look at them. And then what we'll do, of course, is we'll give you some things to look at. So here, once again, and if you master these things, you should be in good shape. Remember what we tell you, though. It is important to understand that this is a lot of information. And just in looking at the Cold War and post-war America, World War II America alone is a lot of information. And the best way to learn a lot of information fast is by utilizing the flashcards. And we've told you how important they are, and we've given you an example of what you can do, of course, to be successful with them. And the important thing is that anyone, of course, can help you study and master that information. Once again, this is Coach Anderson from Mississippi Public Broadcasting Online U.S. History from 1877 to present. And as I told you, it is very important that you study and master the facts when it comes to U.S. history. And then just a little common sense is all you'll need, of course, to be successful. And with that, we'll see you next time.